Marcus Johnson parked his car outside the modest apartment complex where he used to live with Tanya and their daughter Alaya. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as he checked his watch. It was Friday, 5:30 p.m., time for his weekend visits with his 6-year-old daughter. As he walked up the concrete steps, a familiar mix of emotions washed over him. Joy at seeing Alaya, tension at facing Tanya, and the growing uneasiness that had been following him for months now. Tanya opened the door before he could knock. Her expression was guarded as usual. "She's still packing her backpack," Tanya said, stepping aside to let him in. Marcus nodded and stood awkwardly in the living room. Photos of Aliyah covered the walls: her kindergarten graduation, her dance recital, her missing tooth smile. In each one, Marcus noticed what everyone had been pointing out lately. "Daddy!" Aliyah burst into the room and threw herself into his arms. Her curly hair bounced as he lifted her up for a hug. "Hey, princess, ready for our weekend?" Marcus smiled, pushing his worries aside. "I made a new friend at school. Her name is Zoe and she has a puppy, and she said maybe I can visit her puppy sometime," Aliyah said in one excited breath. Marcus laughed. "That sounds fun. We'll talk about it in the car. Okay, say goodbye to your mom now." While Aliyah hugged Tanya goodbye, Marcus couldn't help but study his daughter's features. Her skin was a shade lighter than his. Her nose was small and upturned, nothing like his broader one. And those eyes, hazel with flecks of green that matched neither his dark brown eyes nor Tanya's. "Got everything?" he asked, taking Aliyah's backpack. "Let's go then." In the car, Aliyah chatted happily about school and friends while Marcus drove, nodding and responding at all the right moments. But his mind kept returning to last month's family barbecue. His cousin Darnell that pulled him aside while they watched the kids play. "Man, I don't want to start anything, but Aliyah don't really look like you. She's got those light eyes and everything. You ever think about that?" Marcus had brushed it off then, but the comment stuck with him. He'd started noticing other things too. The way Tanya got nervous when he mentioned doing one of those ancestry DNA kits for fun. How she changed the subject when old friends asked who Aliyah looked like in the family. At the red light, 6 weeks after filing the petition, Marcus found himself sitting on a hard wooden bench in courtroom 3B of the county family court. The room smelled of lemon-scented cleaning products and anxiety. Men and women in various stages of family disputes filled the benches, all waiting for Judge Reynolds to decide their fates. Marcus tugged at his tie. He had worn his best suit, the same dark blue one he bought for job interviews. Across the aisle, Tanya sat with her lawyer, a sharp-looking woman in a gray pantsuit. Tanya hadn't looked at him once since entering the courtroom. "Case number 247B, Johnson versus Williams, paternity dispute," the court clerk announced. Marcus's stomach tightened as he walked to the front with his lawyer, a kind but inexperienced public defender named Mr. Patel. The 3 weeks since the DNA test had been the longest of his life. He hadn't been allowed to see Aliyah during this time, a temporary precaution, the court had said. Judge Reynolds looked up from her papers. She was in her 60s with steel gray hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. Her reputation for being strict but fair preceded her. "I have the results of the DNA test requested by Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet courtroom. "Before I read them, I want to remind both parties that these proceedings are about determining biological parentage only. Questions of custody and support will be addressed in separate hearings if necessary." Marcus nodded, his mouth dry. Across from him, Tanya stared at her hands. "Mr. Marcus Johnson," Judge Reynolds continued, looking directly at him, "the DNA analysis shows with 99.9% certainty that you are not the biological father of Aliyah Williams." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Even though he had suspected it, even requested the test himself, hearing it stated so plainly in court made it real in a way he hadn't prepared for. He gripped the table to steady himself. "Your Honor," Tanya's lawyer spoke up, "in light of these results, my client requests immediate termination of all visitation rights and a refund of child support payments made by Mr. Johnson over the past 3 years." Marcus felt the room spin. No more visits. No more bedtime stories or Saturday morning pancakes. No more Aliyah. "Mr. Johnson, do you understand what these results mean?" Judge Reynolds asked, peering at him over her glasses. Several people in the courtroom whispered. This was the moment most men in his position would express anger or relief at being freed from financial responsibility. The court had seen it all before. "I understand the results, Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Then if there are no objections, I am prepared to terminate the established paternity." "Your Honor," Marcus interrupted, causing Mr. Paddle to tug nervously at his sleeve. "May I please say something?" Judge Reynolds looked surprised but nodded. "Go ahead, Mr. Johnson, but keep it brief." Marcus took a deep breath and stepped forward. The courtroom fell completely silent. "Your Honor, I understand what the test says. I'm not denying science. But what I need everyone in this room to understand is that I've been Aaliyah's father in every way that matters for 6 years now." He paused, fighting to keep his voice from breaking. "I was there when she took her first steps. I'm the one who taught her to ride a bike. I'm the one she calls when she has nightmares. I'm not just some man who paid bills. I'm her daddy." As Marcus spoke, Judge Reynolds' expression changed from professional detachment to something else, something that looked almost like realization, followed by shock. The color drained from her face. What Marcus said next would change everything. "Your Honor," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I know what the law says. I know what DNA says, but I'm asking you to consider what love says." The courtroom remained silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers and clearing of throats had stopped. Every eye was on Marcus as he stood tall before Judge Reynolds, whose face had lost all color. "Since Aaliyah was born, I've been there. When she was 3 months old and got her first fever, I was the one who drove through a snowstorm at 2 a.m. to get to the emergency room. I was the one who learned to braid her hair by watching YouTube videos for hours because she wanted braids like the girls at daycare." Marcus pulled out his wallet and carefully removed a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it to reveal a child's drawing. "This is what Aaliyah drew for Father's Day last year. That's me," he pointed to a tall stick figure. "And that's her," he pointed to a smaller figure holding the taller one's hand. "She wrote 'Best Daddy Ever' on it. She doesn't know about DNA tests or biology. All she knows is that I'm her daddy." Tanya shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her lawyer whispered something in her ear, but she shook her head. "For the past 3 years since Tanya and I split up, I've never missed a weekend visit. I've never been late with child support. I call Aaliyah every night before bed to tell her a story, even when I'm working late shifts." Judge Reynolds removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. In 20 years on the bench, she had seen hundreds of men celebrate being freed from paternity obligations. She had never seen someone fight to keep them. "Mr. Johnson," the judge said, "I understand your emotional attachment to the child, but the law is clear about—" "With all due respect, Your Honor," Marcus interrupted, causing a few gasps from the gallery, "I'm not just emotionally attached. I'm her father. Biology didn't make me take her to dance classes or help her with homework or kiss her scraped knees. I did those things because I chose to be her father every single day." Marcus turned to look at Tanya for the first time since entering the courtroom. "Tanya knows I'm a good father. She knows Aaliyah loves me. Taking me away from her now would hurt Aaliyah most of all." Tanya's eyes filled with tears. She looked down quickly. "Your Honor," Marcus continued, turning back to the judge, "I'm not here to fight with Tanya or to make accusations about the past. What's done is done. I'm here fighting for my daughter's future." Judge Reynolds leaned forward, studying Marcus closely. The usual stern line of her mouth had softened slightly. "What exactly are you asking for, Mr. Johnson?" "I'm asking to remain Aaliyah's legal father. I'm asking to continue my visitation rights. I'm asking to keep being the only daddy she's ever known." Mr. Patel, who had been frantically flipping through his legal books, finally spoke up. "Your Honor, there are some precedents for psychological parenthood in cases like this. In Simmons v. Dobson, the court recognized." Judge Reynolds held up her hand to silence him. Her face had regained some color, but her expression remained troubled. "This is unusual," she said slowly. "Mr. Johnson, are you saying you want to continue paying child support and maintaining parental responsibilities for a child you now know is not biologically yours?" Marcus nodded firmly. "Yes, Your Honor. That's exactly what I'm saying." The judge looked at him for a long moment, then at Tanya, who was now openly crying. "I believe we need to recess," Judge Reynolds finally said, her voice slightly unsteady. "This case requires more consideration than I anticipated." As the bailiff called for everyone to rise, whispers spread through the courtroom like wildfire. Marcus had just done something truly unexpected, and nobody, especially Judge Reynolds, quite knew what to do next. Judge Helen Reynolds sat alone in her chambers during the court recess. She removed her black robe and hung it carefully on the wooden coat rack in the corner. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured herself a glass of water from the pitcher on her desk. In 20 years on the family court bench, she had developed a reputation for being fair but unsentimental. The law was the law. Biology was biology. And in her courtroom, these facts had always been enough to decide cases like Marcus Johnson's. Until today. She picked up the DNA test results again, as if reading them one more time might change what they said. The science was clear. Marcus Johnson was not Alaya's biological father. In hundreds of similar cases, Judge Reynolds had ruled swiftly, relieving the non-biological father of all legal responsibilities and financial obligations. It was the clean, logical solution. But Marcus Johnson didn't want to be relieved of his responsibilities. His words echoed in her mind. "Biology didn't make me take her to dance classes or help her with homework or kiss her scraped knees. I did those things because I chose to be her father every single day." The judge walked to her window, looking out at the courthouse square below. People rushed by, living their complicated lives, forming bonds that had nothing to do with genetics. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Her clerk, a young woman named Sarah, entered with a file folder. "You asked for the case files on psychological parenthood, Your Honor." "Yes, thank you." Judge Reynolds took the folder and placed it on her desk. "Sarah, do you have children?" Sarah looked surprised at the personal question. "Yes, Your Honor. A son, age 4. And your husband? He's a good father." "The best?" Sarah smiled. "He's actually my second husband. He's not Tommy's biological father, but he's been raising him since he was 1. Tommy doesn't know any other dad." Judge Reynolds felt something shift inside her. And if someone tried to separate them based solely on biology? Sarah's smile faded. "It would destroy them both, Your Honor." After Sarah left, Judge Reynolds sat heavily in her chair and opened the file. Cases of psychological parenthood were rare, but not unprecedented. Courts in several states had recognized that sometimes the emotional bond between a non-biological parent and child deserved legal protection. She flipped through case after case: Simmons v. Dobson, Miller v. State Department of Family Services, Bowen v. Bowen. In each one, judges had been forced to look beyond simple biology to the messy, complicated reality of human relationships. Judge Reynolds thought about her own father, a stern, distant man who had provided financially but had never attended a school play or soccer game. Biologically, he was her father, but in the ways that mattered most to a child. She picked up a framed photo on her desk. It showed a younger version of herself and her stepfather, Richard, at her law school graduation. Richard, who had no biological connection to her, had been the one to encourage her legal aspirations, to quiz her on case law, to beam with pride when she passed the bar exam. A tear slipped down her cheek, surprising her. She quickly wiped it away, embarrassed even though no one was there to see it. The intercom on her desk buzzed. "Your Honor, the parties are ready to return to the courtroom whenever you are." "Thank you," she replied. "Give me 5 more minutes." Judge Reynolds put the photo down and picked up her legal pad. She began writing quickly, outlining a decision that would likely be appealed, possibly overturned, and certainly criticized by her more traditional colleagues. But for perhaps the first time in her judicial career, Helen Reynolds was prepared to rule with her heart as well as her head. She put on her robe again, feeling its weight on her shoulders. As she prepared to return to the courtroom, she knew her face must still show the impact of her realization that the legal system she had served for 2 decades sometimes failed to recognize the most important bonds in human life. Marcus Johnson had come to her courtroom seeking justice, and now, with pale face but resolute mind, Judge Reynolds was determined to find a way to provide it. #. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation when Judge Reynolds returned from recess. Her usual confident stride was replaced with a more thoughtful pace as she took her seat at the bench. The court fell silent. After careful consideration, Judge Reynolds began, I have decided that this case requires more than a simple ruling on biological parentage. Mr. Johnson has raised important questions about psychological parenthood that deserve proper legal examination. She looked directly at Marcus. I am ordering a temporary continuation of the current visitation arrangement while we proceed with a full hearing on parental rights. This court will reconvene in 2 weeks. As people filed out of the courtroom, Marcus felt a mix of relief and anxiety. He had won a small victory, the right to keep seeing Alaya, but the real battle was just beginning. What happens now? Marcus asked Mr. Patel as they gathered their papers. Now we build a case, Mr. Patel replied, with newfound respect in his eyes. We need to prove your psychological parenthood is in Alaya's best interest. The next morning, Marcus received notice that Tanya had hired a new lawyer, Diane Mitchell, one of the city's top family attorneys. Known for her aggressive tactics, Mitchell had built her reputation winning difficult custody cases. She's going to fight hard, Mr. Patel warned during their strategy meeting at his small office. Mitchell will argue that maintaining a relationship with you will only confuse Alaya. She'll say a clean break is better. That's ridiculous, Marcus said, his hands curling into fists. Alaya doesn't need a clean break from the only father she's ever known. I agree, Mr. Patel said, but we need more than passion. We need evidence. Over the next week, Marcus collected letters from Alaya's teachers describing his involvement in her education. He gathered photos of birthdays, holidays, and ordinary days that showed 6 years of fatherhood. His mother provided a statement about his dedication to Alaya. Even his employer wrote about the times Marcus had adjusted his work schedule for Alaya's needs. 5 days before the hearing, Tanya called Marcus unexpectedly. We need to talk, she said, her voice tight with emotion. Not through lawyers, just us. They met at a quiet coffee shop halfway between their homes. Tanya looked tired, the strain of the case visible in the dark circles under her eyes. Alaya keeps asking when she can see you, Tanya said after an uncomfortable silence. She cries at night. She doesn't understand what's happening. Marcus felt a pang in his chest. I miss her too. My lawyer says I should cut all ties between you two. She says it's cleaner legally. Tanya stared into her coffee cup. But I'm not sure that's right for Alaya. It's not, Marcus said simply. You know it's not. Tanya looked up, tears in her eyes. I made a mistake, Marcus. A big one. But I never meant for Alaya to get hurt. This isn't about punishing you, Marcus said. It's about what's best for our daughter. He paused, realizing he had said our daughter without thinking. She is your daughter, Tanya said quietly, seeming to read his thoughts. In all the ways that matter. The conversation gave Marcus hope, but Mitchell wasn't ready to back down. The next day, she filed a motion arguing that Marcus had no legal standing to request parental rights. When Mr. Patel called with the news, Marcus felt his stomach drop. Can she do that? She can try, Mr. Patel said. But we got something they don't. What's that? A father who's fighting to stay in his child's life, not to escape responsibility. That counts for something, even in family court. As the hearing date approached, the case attracted attention beyond the courtroom. A local newspaper ran a story about the unusual custody battle. Other non-biological parents called Marcus to share similar stories. The night before the hearing, Marcus couldn't sleep. He sat in Alaya's room in his apartment, surrounded by her toys and books, wondering if this would be the last night he could rightfully call himself her father. On the morning of the hearing, Marcus arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early. He was surprised to find a small crowd gathered on the steps. About 20 people stood together, some holding handmade signs that read "Fatherhood is more than DNA" and "Stand with Marcus." What's all this? Marcus asked, approaching the group cautiously. A woman stepped forward. She had warm brown eyes and a kind smile. I'm Dr. Renee Washington, child psychologist at City Children's Hospital. We read about your case in the newspaper. We? Marcus looked around at the diverse group. Parents, teachers, counselors, and child advocates. Dr. Washington explained. People who understand that a child's well-being depends on stable relationships, not just biology. A tall man in a suit extended his hand to Marcus. James Thornton, Family Law Reform Coalition. Your case could help change how courts view non-biological parents. We'd like to support you. Before Marcus could respond, a local news van pulled up. A reporter and cameraman jumped out, heading straight for him. "Mr. Johnson, can we get a statement about your custody battle?" the reporter asked, thrusting a microphone toward him. Mr. Patel appeared at Marcus's side, gently steering him away. "No comments at this time," he told the reporter. Then to Marcus, "Let's get inside. The media attention might help later, but right now we need to focus on the hearing." In the courthouse lobby, more surprises awaited. 3 of Alaya's teachers stood talking quietly. They waved when they saw Marcus. His boss was there too, along with several coworkers who had taken the morning off to show support. "I had no idea," Marcus whispered to Mr. Patel, feeling overwhelmed. "Your story touched a nerve," Mr. Patel replied. "People recognize what real fatherhood looks like." Inside the courtroom, Marcus spotted Tanya sitting with her attorney. She looked nervous, fidgeting with her purse strap. Their eyes met briefly before she looked away. Judge Reynolds entered, and everyone rose. She seemed surprised by the packed courtroom. "I see we have quite an audience today," she noted. "I'll remind everyone that this is a court of law, not a public forum. Any disruptions will result in immediate removal." The hearing began with Mitchell arguing forcefully that Marcus had no legal standing. "The DNA test is conclusive, Your Honor. Mr. Johnson is not Alaya's father. While his emotional attachment to the child is understandable, it creates no legal rights." When it was Mr. Patel's turn, he called his first witness, Dr. Washington. "Dr. Washington, in your professional opinion, what would happen to a 6-year-old child who suddenly loses contact with the only father she's ever known?" Mr. Patel asked. "It would be deeply traumatic," Dr. Washington testified. "Children form attachments based on consistent care and emotional bonding, not biology. Disrupting such a primary attachment can cause lasting psychological harm." Next came Alaya's first-grade teacher, who described how Marcus attended every parent-teacher conference and volunteered for field trips. "He's the most involved father in my class," she said. "Alaya talks about him constantly." Marcus's mother took the stand, her voice shaking with emotion as she described watching her son become a dedicated father. He changed his whole life for that little girl, worked extra shifts to buy her nice things, learned to cook healthy meals. He even joined a parenting group to learn how to raise a confident daughter. Throughout the testimony, Marcus noticed Judge Reynolds watching him carefully. He also saw Tanya growing increasingly uncomfortable, whispering urgently to her lawyer. During a brief recess, Marcus stepped into the hallway for water. He found himself surrounded by supporters offering encouragement. "You're changing things," James Thornton told him. "Win or lose, you're showing the world what fatherhood really means." Marcus nodded, too emotional to speak. As he turned to go back into the courtroom, he spotted Tanya standing alone by a window. Their eyes met again, but this time she didn't look away. Something had shifted. Marcus could feel it. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, he allowed himself to hope. The final day of hearings arrived with tension hanging in the air. The courtroom was even more crowded than before, with people standing along the back wall. A few law students had secured seats, furiously taking notes on this unusual case. Judge Reynolds entered looking solemn. The bags under her eyes suggested she had been up late reviewing the case. "Before we begin today's proceedings," the judge announced, "I've received a request from Ms. Williams's counsel for a brief private meeting in my chambers with both parties and their attorneys." Whispers rippled through the courtroom as Marcus followed Mr. Patel, Tanya, and Ms. Mitchell into the judge's chambers. Inside, Judge Reynolds gestured for everyone to sit. "Ms. Mitchell, you requested this meeting. The floor is yours." Mitchell cleared her throat. "Your Honor, after careful consideration and lengthy discussions with my client, we would like to propose a settlement." Marcus straightened in his chair, hardly daring to hope. "Ms. Williams recognizes Mr. Johnson's significant role in Alaya's life," Mitchell continued. "She is willing to agree to continued visitation rights if Mr. Johnson drops his petition for legal parental status." Mr. Patel looked at Marcus questioningly. "That's not enough," Marcus said quietly but firmly. "Visitation can be changed or taken away. I need legal protection for my relationship with Alaya." Tanya spoke up suddenly. "I won't take her away from you." Her voice was thick with emotion. "I was wrong to even try." Judge Reynolds studied Tanya carefully. Ms. Williams, are you saying you support Mr. Johnson's petition for parental rights, despite the DNA results? Tanya nodded slowly. Aaliyah needs her father, and Marcus is her father, no matter what the test says. Mitchell looked uncomfortable but didn't contradict her client. This changes things, Judge Reynolds said. Let's return to the courtroom. Back in the courtroom, a buzz of anticipation filled the air as Judge Reynolds announced that Ms. Williams now supported Mr. Johnson's petition. In light of this development and all the testimony presented, I am prepared to rule, Judge Reynolds said. The room fell completely silent. Family law exists to protect children, not simply to enforce biological connections, she began. In this case, we have a man who has acted as a father in every meaningful way for 6 years. We have a child who knows only this man as her father. And we have overwhelming evidence that maintaining this relationship is in the child's best interest. Judge Reynolds paused, looking directly at Marcus. Therefore, I am granting Mr. Johnson status as Aaliyah's legal psychological parent. This means he will retain visitation rights and shared decision-making authority regarding Aaliyah's education, health care, and general welfare. Gasps and murmurs spread through the courtroom. Mr. Paddle squeezed Marcus's shoulder. Furthermore, Judge Reynolds continued, I am ordering that Mr. Johnson's name remain on Aaliyah's birth certificate, as removing it would serve no constructive purpose and could potentially harm the child. She banged her gavel once. My written opinion will explain the legal basis for this decision in detail. For now, I will say only that our courts must evolve to recognize that families come in many forms, and a child's best interests sometimes requires us to look beyond biology. The courtroom erupted in applause. Judge Reynolds banged her gavel again. Order. This is still a courtroom. As people began to file out, Marcus sat stunned, unable to move. He had won, not just for himself, but potentially for other non-biological parents facing similar situations. Tanya approached hesitantly. Can we talk about a schedule for Aaliyah? She's been asking when she can come back to your place. Of course, Marcus managed, his voice thick with emotion. This weekend? Tanya nodded. She'll be so happy. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered around Marcus, asking for comments. Legal experts were already debating the implications of Judge Reynolds' decision. This ruling could set a precedent for psychological parenthood cases across the state, one commentator explained to a news camera. But Marcus hardly heard them. All he could think about was that he would be making pancakes for Aaliyah this Saturday morning, just like always. He was still her father. The law now recognized what his heart had always known. 2 years passed since Judge Reynolds' landmark ruling. On a warm Saturday morning, Marcus stood on the sidelines of a soccer field, cheering as 8-year-old Aaliyah dribbled the ball down the field. Go, Aaliyah, you got this, he called out, cupping his hands around his mouth. Next to him stood Tanya, clapping enthusiastically as their daughter scored a goal. The tension that had once defined their relationship had gradually melted into a respectful co-parenting partnership. She's getting really good, Tanya said, smiling as Aaliyah ran back to position, giving them both a quick wave. Coach says she's a natural, Marcus replied proudly. After the game, as they walked to the parking lot, a woman approached them hesitantly. Excuse me, she said. Are you Marcus Johnson? Marcus nodded, curious. I'm sorry to bother you, the woman continued, but I recognized you from the news stories. Your case, it helped me keep my son, her eyes filled with tears. The judge cited Reynolds v. Johnson in his decision last month. Marcus was stunned. Reynolds v. Johnson. They named the case after us? Yes, the woman said. It's being taught in law schools now. My lawyer said your case changed everything for non-biological parents. After the woman left, Aaliyah looked up at Marcus curiously. Dad, what was she talking about? What's a non-biological parent? Marcus and Tanya had exchanged glances. They had discussed when and how to explain things to Aaliyah, and both agreed she was still too young for the full story. It's complicated, sweetie, Marcus said, kneeling to her level, but it basically means that families come in all different types, and sometimes the law needs to catch up with that. Aaliyah seemed satisfied with this answer and skipped ahead to the car. Later that week, Marcus received a letter from the State Bar Association inviting him to speak at a conference on family law reform. Similar invitations had become common over the past 2 years, as his case had indeed sparked changes throughout the legal system. 5 states had already revised their family laws to include specific provisions for psychological parenthood. 2 others had pending legislation, and most importantly, dozens of children remained with the parents who had raised them, regardless of biological connections. On a crisp fall afternoon, Marcus found himself back in the same courthouse where it all began. This time, he was there as a guest speaker for a judicial training session. As he waited outside the conference room, he spotted a familiar figure approaching. "Mr. Johnson," Judge Reynolds said warmly, extending her hand. "Thank you for coming today." The judge had aged slightly in the past 2 years, with a few more gray hairs at her temples, but her eyes were brighter somehow, less burdened. "I couldn't say no when you invited me, Your Honor," Marcus replied. "Your decision changed our lives." Judge Reynolds smiled. "You know, I've handled hundreds of cases in my career, but yours is the one people always ask about. It's the one I'll remember when I retire next year." "You're retiring?" Marcus asked, surprised. "Yes, and I'm writing a book about family law reform. Your case will be the centerpiece." She paused. "How is Alaya doing?" Marcus pulled out his phone and showed her a recent photo of Alaya in her soccer uniform. "She's thriving," he said. "And she knows she's loved. That's what matters most." The judge nodded. "That is indeed what matters most." As they walked into the conference room together, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From the painful moment of learning he wasn't Alaya's biological father to becoming a symbol for a new legal understanding of parenthood. But the most important victory wasn't in courtrooms or law books. It was in Saturday morning pancakes, in soccer game cheers, in bedtime stories, and in the simple words Alaya said every night, "Love you, Dad." Biology hadn't made Marcus a father. Love had. And now, finally, the law recognized what his heart had known all along.